Hey everybody. So like I mentioned in the email that I sent you all late last night, this video, or rather series of videos, I think I'm going to do at least two, perhaps three, depending on length. Um, they are going to be meant to replace what would have been today's class, in which we were going to be wrapping up Stuart Hall and doing a bit of a review, and then starting to put the pieces together to make sense of Roland Barthes' really seminal essay, The Death of the Author. I would say that in the field of literary theory, there is no more influential, no more frequently anthologized essay than Barthes' The Death of the Author. Even though it's written in 1968, it is this text that I think still beguiles readers today and still opens up lots of really interesting possibilities for thinking and for reading and for writing. And that's really the kind of privileged term in Barthes. He says that the death of the author gives way to the birth of the reader. And by the reader, he means almost something like a writer. The reader becomes a writer in Barthes. And we're going to talk about what that means, what that really kind of suggestive idea actually entails, right? But before we get into Roland Barthes, I want to make sure that we are on the same page when it comes to Stuart Hall's essay, which I think we had a really good discussion about last time, and I get the sense that people do understand the theory that Hall is giving us, even as we all might have difficulty parsing the text. It's a densely theoretical text, and it's extremely difficult, especially for a first pass. But I do think that now, once we kind of have the model in front of us, we can go back to Hall and make better sense, I think, of some of that really kind of difficult language that he's giving us, right? Okay, so remember when I said, and I've said this a couple of times, that one of the kind of strategies that you might employ when it comes to parsing and reading really difficult theoretical material is to treat it, like you would any essay. When I look when I'm looking at an essay, first of all, I'm looking for the thesis statement, but especially if it's a research project, what I'm looking for is that the writer has a sense of the field of scholarship in which he is entering, or in which she is entering. And so on the one hand, I want you to know the argument that these texts are all making, but also, and related to that, I want you to understand what kinds of critical interventions these texts are making. So remember, Wimsatt and Beardsley are not just sort of theorizing out of nowhere, out of the blue. They're part of this culture that they think is doing literary studies incorrectly, or rather in a flawed or limited way. So they look at the health of their discipline and they say, why are all of these English professors so focused on biographical criticism? There's no rigor to what they're doing. There's no analytical tough-mindedness behind their readings. They're really just sort of chit-chatting about biography, and that's not enough. So they're really intervening on their discipline. They're proposing a way of reading that is specifically in rejection of the way that things are kind of typically done circa 1946, 47 when they write the thing. Hall is no different, right? Well, he is different, I guess, in this one sense, that he's not exactly giving us a thesis statement in Encoding, Decoding. What he is rather doing is proposing a theoretical model for understanding what he calls the communication process, right? One of the things that Hall has been criticized for, and this essay has been critiqued for, is that he doesn't give us any empirical evidence. This is not an evidence-supported theory. It is purely theoretical, right? So he doesn't actually look at test cases. We sort of looked at a hypothetical test case when we were thinking about the Tide Company last time. Hall never really gets that specific. This is a theoretical model that he thinks is testable, but he himself doesn't test it. So that's, I think, important to know. But at any rate, it's not so much a thesis statement as it is a description of a model that Hall wants to replace the dominant model in communications theory at the time. Remember that Hall is writing in the early 80s. This is a period when the United States sort of gets hip to the language and the methodological practices of cultural studies. Cultural studies starts in Britain around 30s, 40s, really takes root in the 50s with a figure named Stuart Hall and the people around Hall, or sorry, not Stuart Hall, Raymond Williams, rather. Raymond Williams is kind of the important figure in British cultural studies of the mid-century. Well, Hall sort of takes British cultural studies across the Atlantic and deposits it in America. So the theoretical model is this four-part theoretical model. The typical way that things had been done at the time, says Hall, is the theoretical models that media theorists were proposing was, in his mind, too linear. It starts with the producer of the message, the sender of the message. That sender sends a message, and the receiver receives that message. So then the question is, okay, well, what is the job of a media theorist or a media scholar? And for Hall, things were too focused on the effects of the message. Media theorists would look at what exactly is it that viewers or listeners or readers do with their understanding of the message that they have gleaned from the sender. So there are any number of things that one can do with a message. You either vote for that candidate over there, or you don't vote at all, or you continue watching this TV show, or you turn it off, or you buy the product, or you don't buy the product. Everything kind of hinges on what the receiver of the message does in the real world with it. That is to say, everything hinges on the effects of the message, the tangible kind of quantitative effects. For Hall, this is a limited model. It's too linear. It doesn't account for a whole host of kind of nuances within the communication process that he gives us in his four-part theory of encoding and decoding. There's a really important quotation that I think clarifies what Hall means when he's talking about the behaviorism that infects media theory at the time. This is on page 94, so take a second or two and grab your text and turn to page 94. This is on the portion of the side of the page right underneath the model that he gives us. So I'll read from that just to give you a passage where Hall is describing what his problem is with this old theoretical model focusing on effects of messages. Okay, so he says at the top of the paragraph, the application of this rudimentary paradigm has already begun to transform our understanding of the older term television content. Remember, his focus here is on television. It's an interesting question to think, in what ways is his model amenable to literary studies? I think it is in certain ways. We are just beginning to see how it might also transform our understanding of audience reception, reading, and response as well. Beginnings and endings have been announced in communications research before, so we must be cautious. But there seems some ground for thinking that a new and exciting phase in so-called audience research of a quite new kind may be opening up. At either end of the communication chain, or rather the communicative chain, the use of the semiotic paradigm promises to dispel the lingering behaviorism that has dogged mass media research for so long. The lingering behaviorism, I'll repeat that, the lingering behaviorism which has dogged mass media research for so long, especially in its approach to content. And then this is very important. This is the part that you might want to underline. Though we know the television program is not a behavioral input, like a tap on the knee, it seems to have been almost impossible for traditional researchers to conceptualize the communicative process without lapsing into one or other variant of low flying behaviorism. So just, think about that image that he's giving us, and think about what the implications are for that image as a metaphor for describing what he thinks people typically think the communicative process is like. So, I'll show you here. This is my knee. The doctor comes over. He gives me the hammer on the knee, harder than that, and I instinctively kick it out. What is suggestive about that image is that what Hall seems to be suggesting is that the old way of thinking about media theory and the ways in which the message may have an effect, one effect or the other on a receiver, is that that old model, that behaviorist model, doesn't seem to have any room in it for audience agency, for agency of the receiver. When the doctor comes over and taps your kneecap with the hammer, you involuntarily kick out your knee. It's not like your brain sends a kind of conscious signal to your knee and says, okay, now's the time to kick. It happens pretty naturally. It happens instinctually. It happens involuntarily. We don't really have a control over it. Now, if that's the way that people typically think of receivers of television messages or other kinds of messages in the media landscape, we could be talking about radio too, perhaps. Well, you're imagining, I think, in that model, a receiver who is pretty passive. I mean, who is extremely passive, who doesn't really seem to have the ability to negotiate a different kind of position vis-a-vis the sender of the message or the message itself. It's almost a kind of Pavlovian model, like you ding a bell and my mouth waters because I've learned to associate the dinging of the bell with food. I think Hall in his theory has a more, I think, robust theory of reader and receiver agency. It's a limited kind of agency. It's a limited kind of autonomy that we exercise over the media messages that we all get inundated with every single day. But I think that there is a lot of space in Hall's theory for thinking about the kinds of things that receivers can do other than merely accept the message, lock, stock, and barrel. Right. So I think that's a really important thing to think about, is that Hall's theory is really one that is trying to come to grips with the question: how much agency, how much freedom, how much autonomy do receivers really have when they get fed a media message? And a good term to have in mind, I think, might be relative autonomy. It's not kind of full autonomy. I don't think Hall imagines that we as receivers of messages can literally kind of hear whatever message that we want, or do with that message literally whatever we want. I don't think that that's what Hall is saying. I think he's proposing something more limited and slightly more nuanced than that. So that, I think, is the concept of relative autonomy is one that is pretty important to understanding his four-part theory of the communicative process. It starts with production. From production, we move to circulation. That is, how does the message get disseminated? From circulation, we move to distribution and consumption. And from distribution consumption, we move to reproduction. Remember that instead of the linear model that other media theorists that Hall has in mind are proposing, Hall's model is much more circular. He makes this really important point that when we reproduce the knowledges that we glean from meanings, or the meanings that we glean from messages, when we reproduce those as social practices, that has a real tangible effect on the production side of things. So just think about, you watch a television show and you decide for yourself, this is exactly the kind of thing that I want to watch. So you watch it, and then you watch the next episode, and then you watch the next episode after that, and lo and behold, so do 20 million people who are just like you. So what happens at the level of production then? Well, a production team behind the making of messages, we can imagine sort of like a corporate structure of media production. Up in the big office up on the top floor, a bunch of moguls get together and they say, wow, that show CSI is really taking off. Audiences really seem to love it. Well, what's the next question that somebody's going to ask? Probably something like, well, do we have any other shows just like it that we can put on the air? Because nothing predicts future audience behavior like past audience behavior. So if an audience behaves in a particular way, that is, they decide this is a show that I want to keep watching, and they continue watching it. That is what Hall has in mind when he says that meanings need to be reproduced as social practices. That is a social practice, continuing to watch a show. It makes manifest meaning in the world. That behavior, that act of continuing to watch the show, continuing to watch shows just like it, impacts in a really tangible way, says Hall, what's going on at the level of production. So audiences in reproducing meanings can actually determine in some ways how future meanings get produced. So it's a kind of circular model. Within each stage of this production model, or this communicative model, moving from production to circulation to consumption to reproduction, Hall says that each one of those stages has within it its own kind of relative autonomy. So when you think on the left side of Hall's model, the production/circulation side, this is where the encoding of a message takes place. That's the encoding side of things. You can say, okay, well, when production comes up with the message that they want their production team to circulate, production might come up with the message in its kind of raw form. But then what has to happen to the message as it moves from production to circulation? Well, it has to be translated, right? And if it's television, it has to be translated into a very particular idiom. The idea that somebody has up in the office on the top floor has to be translated into the visual language of television, into the sonic language of television. It has to basically get filtered through the media apparatus that is television. There is no raw event, Hall reminds us, right? There's no way that we access kind of pure ideas outside of their discursive formations. So as we move from production to circulation, it's not like the message gets transmitted perfectly. It has to adapt, it has to change. And in that adaptation, there is room for the message to get twisted, for it to get distorted, for it to get contorted, for it to change, for it to alter, for it to shift, etc., etc. This isn't sort of like a pure handing of the baton. The baton looks very different once we get to reproduction from what it looked like in the production stage. So we move from production to circulation to reception or consumption, says Hall, to reproduction. These, says Hall, are, quote, linked but distinctive moments. So it's not as if the message completely takes a randomly new shape or a radically new shape as it moves along this process. There is still some control that the producer of the meaning has over how that meaning gets ultimately interpreted. But there's a limit to that. It's not like these messages just get translated without changing them in any way, shape, or form. So the model, or thinking about translation, might be a kind of good model for you to think about. What happens to a text when we move it from English to French? Well, there might be certain untranslatables. There might be a word in French. There are many words in French that we simply just don't have in English. So if I write, a text in French and I want to translate it to English, how do I say that thing? I don't know. I have to change it into the idiom of the language in which you are ultimately going to receive it. That is something like what happens in Hall's communication model. Okay, where do I want to go from there? I guess the last thing that you want to know about Hall has to do with these three positions from which he thinks that receivers of messages can receive those messages. There are three positions, and within those positions, there's I think a lot of interesting things going on. So the first position that we can take vis-a-vis a message is what Hall calls the dominant hegemonic position. This is something like kind of pure transparent communication. As a receiver of the message, I basically accept, I don't basically accept, I do accept, I truly accept the message as it is presented to me in the form in which I find it. So the producer has a meaning in mind, and I glean that meaning, and there you have it. Yeah, I accept the full totality of the message. The second position is what Hall calls a negotiated position. I think that the negotiated position is probably the most common. I think that most of us probably, at least those of us who are, have grown up to be savvy and critical about mass communications, most of us tend not to accept media messages full stop. Most of us think, okay, well, part of this is okay, part of this makes sense, but part of it doesn't. That's what Hall means very simply by the negotiated position. If I'm going to negotiate a position vis-a-vis a message, I'm going to accept some of it, but I'm going to tweak it or alter that meaning slightly to suit my own purposes. So think about this example. McDonald's gives me a commercial. I'm watching a football game, and here's a McDonald's commercial, and it's a really happy family, and they're enjoying a meal. And in that Pavlovian way that we're all kind of susceptible to, we think to ourselves, well, geez, now I'm hungry. Now what? Well, a dominant hegemonic position would go something like this. Geez, now I'm hungry. What do? I guess I go to McDonald's. Like, what else could I possibly do? There's only one message to glean from this, or there's only one meaning to glean from this message, and it is, I am hungry. I require food. I must go to McDonald's. Full stop. Something like a negotiated position might go like this. Yes, there seems to be an unambiguous good in going to a restaurant and enjoying a meal with my friends or family. I accept that. I also happen to be hungry thanks to that commercial, which showed me a bunch of food, and now I'm starving. But then I say to myself, well, no, I'm not going to be susceptible to this kind of advertising. I say to myself, in my kind of most high-minded way, I'm not going to be subjected to this. I'm not going to fall prey to this. But geez, I still am actually really hungry, so I'm going to go to Tim Hortons instead. That is a very simple kind of silly example of something like a negotiated position. And the oppositional position is something much more active, I think, on the part of the receiver. The receiver understands the message in the oppositional position. I understand that Nike is trying to sell me shoes. I understand that Nike is trying to sell me a particular image of masculinity. I know that Nike would very much like me to walk down to Foot Locker and buy a pair of Air Jordans, but no, I'm not going to do that. In fact, I'm going to do something like the Adbusters magazine advertisement, or kind of mock advertisement that I showed you last time, where they take the symbol of the Nike swoosh and they put it against a background of slave labor to remind you that whenever Nike is talking in your ear, that Nike, the shoes that Nike wants to sell you, are made in far-flung countries in which their labor practices are not as good as our labor practices. Very simply put, right? So that is something like an oppositional position. Now remember, or reflect on this, I guess, that Hall's model doesn't seem to offer any position for the person who simply wants to opt out, the person who understands the message, but who sort of does the equivalent of walks away from it, never thinks about it again, doesn't negotiate a position, doesn't really accept the dominant hegemonic position, doesn't do anything especially oppositional. You simply just sort of reject it and ignore it. Hall, I don't think, thinks that we do that with messages, unless we truly don't understand them, unless the visual codes that we're given, unless the linguistic codes that we're given completely elude us. Like, I watch a commercial, I truly don't know what these people are doing, I don't understand the language, I don't understand what is being sold to me, I truly have no way of accessing what's going on here, I walk away and I do nothing with it. Those situations, Hall says, are they happen, But if we truly do understand what's going on, and Hall thinks for the most part, we do, then we have this kind of limited agency available to us. We always are working within the structure of the hegemonic position, the position that was sort of defined for us by the producer. We're always working within that structure. But Hall says that within that structure, there is actually room for insubordination, for subversive behaviors, for oppositional behaviors, for negotiated behaviors, and also, yeah, you can just be that kind of person who accepts lock, stock, and barrel, the meaning of the thing. The last thing I'll say about Hall, and I think this is really important, what he's not saying is that meanings can just be interpreted in any which way. Last time when I tried to make that point, I brought up the example of a Rorschach drawing. If you don't know what a Rorschach drawing is, look it up. The Rorschach drawing is the sort of ink blot that people get handed when they're undergoing a psychiatric or psychological evaluation. You see an ink blot and you say, well, it looks like a butterfly, I guess. And then the person that the FBI is really worried about looks at it and they say, it looks like a human skull. It looks like death. It looks like the embodiment of death. That's an example where I see something, you see something, and hey, what do? We all see things kind of differently. Hall says that's not how we read, that's not how we experience television, it's not how we communicate in the real world. If it were, there would be no means for us to have effective communication. So he's not saying that, yeah, messages can be interpreted in any which way whatsoever because every reader or viewer is different. That's not what he's saying. He is saying that there's no immediate correlation between the message as it has been encoded by the producer and as it has been decoded by the receiver. In one important passage, he says, decodings do not follow inevitably from encodings. That's I think a really important thing. The passage that to kind of get that idea in your head comes around page 100. This is another important one for you to underline if you didn't do it last time. This is like halfway down the page, the paragraph that begins, "It was argued." It was argued, says Hall earlier, that since there is no necessary correspondence between encoding and decoding, the former can attempt to prefer, but cannot prescribe or guarantee the latter, which has its own conditions of existence. Unless they are widely aberrant, encoding will have the effect of constructing some of the limits and parameters within which decodings will operate. If there were no limits, audiences could simply read whatever they liked into any message. No doubt some total understandings of this kind do exist, i.e., I don't understand the language, I don't speak Greek, I don't speak Latin, I don't speak Mandarin, I don't know what the commercial is about, I'm walking away from it. No doubt some total misunderstandings of this kind do exist, but the vast range must contain some degree of reciprocity between encoding and decoding moments. Otherwise, we could not speak of effective communication at all. So that's really important. There's some degree of reciprocity between the message as it has been decoded and the message as it has been encoded. Some degree of reciprocity. But it's really important that it's not total reciprocity. The message as it has been encoded and the message as it has been decoded in Hall are not identical. And to that extent, viewers, listeners, receivers of messages have that degree of autonomy. So to conclude this, I guess now 28-minute video, to conclude, for going forward, you want to know the four-part theoretical model that Hall is proposing. You want to understand what he means when he says relative autonomy, and you want to have those three positions, the dominant hegemonic position, the negotiated position, and the oppositional position. You want to have those sort of memorized moving forward. Okay, that's it for this video. I'm going to hit stop, I'm going to upload it, and then I'm going to give you some more stuff about Roland Barthes. Okay.